having such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. Is it just in the spread of case? Coherent yet unknown name. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on your side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Apocalypse Here. And thank you for joining us for our live stream interview this afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. You'll notice that my background is very different than it was before, as my wife Laura and I moved recently. So we are no longer in Durham. We are in a new place in Roanoke, Virginia. We're still settling in, as you can see, with the empty bookcases and boxes around me. We're still trying to unpack all of our stuff, but I'm glad that we could schedule this stream with our interviewee today, who we've been trying to get on for a while, and schedules are difficult all the time, but I'm glad we could finally do this, and I'm excited to talk to him. So we're going to bring in our guest today, James McGrath. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I feel like our lives were, failing to converge. We were trying to do this, and of course you had to move and other things. But when we finally got together, it turns out I got rid of a filing cabinet. It's like, who needs paper anymore? And so I have some papers that still need to go through on my bookshelf, but have a bookshelf that's largely empty. And so I feel like we've intersected, and even our backgrounds are intersected. I've got like new bookshelves there. Yours will be full with interesting things soon.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, just to get us started, before we kind of move into talking about your book, which I have here. Where did it go? What Jesus Learned from Women, which was released this year. Why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, and good advanced planning, putting the book near the top of a box.
Yeah, right. I kept it with me in my bag because I knew I would be interviewing you once we got here. So.
Good thinking. Yeah, so I'm James McGrath. I'm a professor of religion at Butler University, and occupy the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament language and literature here. But in addition to New Testament, I dabble in all kinds of side interests and other things, ranging from Mandaism, which is at least somewhat related to my field, to things to do with science fiction, which may or may not intersect. If it's a time travel to the time of Jesus story, then it intersects pretty directly with some of the stuff I do. But one of my major areas of interest for the past several years has been the historical figure of Jesus, and this particular book ties in with that.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, first of all, I just want to say I loved this book. I loved reading through it. It was wonderful sort of combination of sort of bringing in sort of literary, imaginative sort of literary stuff into this with, careful historical work. It was really, really, it was a joy to read. And I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciated that. And it was, I'm going to be recommending this to more people than I already have. So yeah, I just wanted to say that up front, that I really dearly enjoyed this book. And I'm curious, and I've heard you sort of explain this on other interviews that you've done, but just for our audience, what was sort of the impetus for this particular project?
And I've been sort of racking my brains to sort of double check what I remember, because what often happens when you write a book is by the time you're done with it, exactly where it first got started and when you first had the thought that led to it is hard to know. Usually I have half a dozen ideas for new books occur to me while I'm working on something that I really should finish first. And so by the time I actually turn to it, it may be a little bit hazy, a little bit fuzzy about exactly how the impetus came about. But in this case, I know that at least a direct prompt was brainstorming with a student who approached me about writing an honors thesis and really wanted to explore whether it was possible, first of all, but already starting to be persuaded that it's possible, what it meant to be both a Christian and a feminist. And thinking about that intersection, she approached me, wanted to do some research, and I immediately thought to myself, okay, well, if you want to do like contemporary theology and things like that, there's probably somebody else who can do a better job of advising that and supervising it. So what could you do in sort of my wheelhouse, right? The kinds of stuff that I do, like studying historical Jesus. And so women in the church, well, there's a lot that's been done on that. Jesus having female disciples and things like that. Yeah, there's still room for more, but it's been looked at. What could a student do that would be research? And so I flipped that on its head and said, what about Jesus learning from women rather than women learning from Jesus? So we looked at that for a change. The student in question, when I proposed this, was not at all interested. She did do a great honors thesis, but on a completely unrelated topic. But the idea stuck with me. And I thought, well, if she doesn't want to write on this, you know what? I think I do. And as I started thinking about it, there are two examples that immediately spring to mind. And if that's all you come up with, then you've got a really short book, but still maybe one worth writing. There's Mary, his mother, because if you deny that he learned from his mother, then you're denying he was a human being. And so that's a pretty safe place to start. And then slightly more controversial, but still widely agreed on, is the case of the Sierraphonician or Canaanite woman, which many people agree, is a story about Jesus' mind being changed through this encounter. But as I thought about it, I realized, the same sort of thing seems to be happening in at least a couple of other stories. And I'll say more about those as I'm sure as the conversation proceeds.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So in your mind, who is this book for? Or are there groups of people that this book is for? Yeah. And I guess another way to put this would, who did you have in mind, I guess, when you were writing this book?
Yeah. So I think it was only as I was writing this book that I finally became persuaded, being connected with academic editors and people like that on social media, that publishers really don't want you to try to persuade them that you can write for every imaginable audience and reach them all equally and do a good job of it and produce a book that will be meaningful to all of them. Murphy's Law does apply to writing books. If you try to please everyone, no one will like it. And so this book is an academic book, right? It is one that goes into enough detail that a person with no background in biblical study would find it challenging. That doesn't mean they couldn't find it enjoyable and engaging, but it does go into the detail that I expect scholars to be interested in. But it still, nonetheless, because I definitely want to be useful at least to clergy, right, and educated people in churches, as well as students who are interested, and not just people in my field who are digging into the kind of stuff that only a handful of us are interested in. I want it to be at least that broad of an audience. And I started trying to figure out ways to see if I can do both those things. Sometimes a lot of it has to do with style. Sometimes it has to do with what you put away in endnotes. Obviously, if you use endnotes at all, then some people, academics, will be really upset. But other readers will then be open to ignoring those things and feeling like they can dive in. So that's another one of those things where you have to choose who you're going to upset and who you're going to make happy, potentially. But one of the things that initially started off as an idea to potentially present the conclusions in a way that might be more interesting, more engaging for a wider audience, was starting each chapter with a bit of historical fiction, telling the story, telling part of the encounter from the perspective of the woman who is the focus of the story. And that would allow me to digest some of the historical conclusions in one place, as well as provide something that hopefully would at least be a hook if I did it well. It turned out that even that, I think, and I hope I will manage to persuade academics in our field, but I'm persuaded that writing fiction, writing historical fiction, actually is a really rigorous way of testing your ideas. There were plenty of times when I tried to tell a story in a particular way, and it just didn't seem plausible, right? Something just wasn't sitting right, and I went and rethought my conclusions, because when you try to actually narrate the history as you envisage it, some things were just not working very well.
Yeah, that last point that you just made, something that Laura and I talk about quite a bit, and that she's really, really good at identifying, and I think you are, as far as what I've read of your work, is that you have a very keen eye for verisimilitude and what really could sort of be plausible and make sense as a story. And I think you're absolutely right that sort of fiction in the way that you sort of use it in your book, kind of exposes how important that really is, right? So I'm thankful that you pointed that out, because that was something that I was thinking about when I was reading those italicized sections at the beginning of each chapter. So I thought that was wonderful. Can you say a little bit about the way that you phrased the title of your book, which is What Jesus Learned from Women?
Right. So why not What Women Taught Jesus?
Right.
So I resisted some desires to make puns, but most of them actually found their way into the book, at least in footnotes or somewhere. So pun lovers, read the footnotes. Things like women who schooled Jesus or something. There are all kinds of things that you could do. You have fun with the title. I thought, well, first of all, how controversial do I want just the title to be? But then also soon found myself thinking of stories that deserve to be included, where I'm not sure that the woman in question was actively teaching Jesus, right? Was saying things to Jesus, trying to change his mind or something like that. May not even have known that Jesus was drawing any conclusions based on what he saw. But think about, say, the widow who puts the 2 coins in the temple treasury. On the one hand, there's the question of, okay, does he actually know that she's putting in all she has, and is there a backstory to that? But on the other hand, it seems to be something where Jesus is pointing this out, and it's some way away in the temple. It's not like right there, so that she's in earshot. And so she may not be thinking that he is talking about her, and maybe processing some things and drawing some conclusions as a result of what she's doing. And so that's the reason for that. It's not quite the passive voice, right? Which then some editor would have drawn a red line through it or something like that. But it still is, and it is putting sort of Jesus front and center, because there's more that could be said about these women. And so I had to decide whether it was going to be a book that really does try to say everything I can about women that Jesus learned from, or whether it's a book about Jesus and what he learned from women. And that ended up being the book I wrote. There's room for a sequel.
There is room for a sequel.
with the other title, right?
Yeah. I hope at some point maybe you do that. I'm curious about the sort of structure of the book, which, as we talked about, is sort of it brings together sort of historical and literary resources. You begin with Jesus's mother, which seems like a good place to start, being Jesus's first teacher, the person from whom he learned initially, to his grandma's house, to the Samaritan woman, Sierraphonician woman, on and on and on, concluding with Joanna, which we'll talk about later, because that is a fascinating chapter to me. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to structure the book in the way that you did? Can you kind of let us in on that kind of process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, introduction and conclusion, not a lot to sort of really explain about where those fall in the book. But in between, I thought about a variety of ways of structuring it. I thought of maybe starting with the Sierraphonician Woman, because maybe more people agree about that. Decided you've got to start with Jesus' mother. It's like formative influence, first influence, like from birth and before, right? It's not sure how much he learned from her prior to birth, but there's a directness and an immediacy and a primacy of place that was necessary there. And then from there, move to a chapter that's fairly speculative, but I think even though some of what one can surmise, if one's willing to entertain at least some plausibility about details from church tradition about Jesus' grandmother, there's a grandmother, right? And so we can say something about Jesus' wider family if we can say anything about that at all. And so framing it in those terms, one of the things I immediately tried to do by putting that chapter next was to clarify that we can't always know which woman had which influence and to what extent, but we can say with confidence that Jesus learned this kind of thing, and it seems to reflect the influence of one of these people in his life, likely female. From there, I went to a story where I thought, the Sierraphonician Woman, by that point I was actually postponing it a little bit because I think it may come a little bit later in Jesus' own life and story, but also because someone changing Jesus' mind versus Jesus learning and adjusting, that story, the question is, to what extent does Jesus have sort of racial prejudices and stereotypes and things like that, and then have them challenged and changed by this encounter? And there are all kinds of issues besides Jesus learning that one has to expect people will have when they approach the story. To some extent, the development of the book and the structuring of the book reflects the fact that there are things that it just made sense to say earlier or later. Kept Mary Magdalene until close to the end because there's a lot to say about her, but also a lot of presuppositions that people have, and so I didn't want to bring her in too early or try less academic readers, people with less background in biblical studies, with a very, very long and detailed chapter. And then Joanna is at the end because that's the chapter that I didn't think when I set out to write the book I was going to have in there. I didn't think there would be enough to say. And as I looked into one possible suggestion about her and who she is and where else she might be mentioned under another name in the New Testament, it suddenly seemed that there was something there that was indeed at least worth exploring. And as I dug into it, just so many threads started connecting between things that are said about what many assume to be different people that I said, okay, this is going in, and I really do think it is an important chapter in its own right in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about that chapter with you. That was probably my, as someone who's very interested in Paul, and that chapter obviously kind of was particularly, interesting to me, but we can talk about that a bit later. One of the issues that tends to arise when we talk about Jesus learning or being taught or growing is that it may seem like for some Christians that Jesus's divinity is somehow being compromised, right? And I've noticed, again, interviews you've done, this comes up all the time. And you sort of anticipate this in the introduction of your book as well. And I've found this a bit puzzling, actually, that people sort of immediately go there. And this may just be because the stuff that I'm bringing to your work, as someone, who I do advocate Chalcedonian Christology, although that's a very broad kind of phrase, right? I confess the creeds, all that sort of stuff. And I'm still a bit confused about that. But what is your initial response to when that concern comes up? When someone says, hey, this seems like it's compromising Jesus' divinity. If we say that Jesus learns, right?
So do we want to specifically say, how does this fit with Chalcedon, or are we going there, or is that...
Oh, no, we don't have to talk about Chalcedon specifically, but just an initial response to someone, maybe a layperson who doesn't really know any of the sort of intricacies of Chalcedon, right? But someone who's like, this feels like it's compromising the divinity of Jesus. How would you sort of initially respond to that?
Right. Well, I'd probably start slowly and find out what they're interested in, where they're coming from.
Yeah.
I might explain early on that one reason why I don't say more about this topic in the book itself is because I'm hedging my bets and avoiding putting anybody off through some particular view I might hold or some conclusion I might draw that really lies beyond the immediate scope of the book, right, which is about the historical figure of Jesus. And so sorting out how that relates to theology is often something that academics in biblical studies set to one side and let other people worry about. So there's good precedence for that. But I really didn't want somebody to come not really thinking about Jesus as anything they're interested in other than as a historical figure and those kinds of questions, and then being put off by the fact that there's this long treatment of how to reconcile this to a particular Christology they don't even hold in the introduction, right? And by that point, maybe I've lost them. And if I put it in other terms, then I might be, somebody might say, oh, so he's one of these people who thinks this. Oh, well, then I don't need to read the rest of the book. And
I see. So yeah.
There was a lot of, I was like, this could only end badly, right?
Right.
If I include more about it. Whereas
very, very strategic move on your part. I see. Yeah.
So I left it for podcasts and vodcasts interviews and other discussions. And maybe, I've thought about writing a study guide or discussion guide that could go with the book,
that would be great. Yeah, for sure.
But as far as the reconciling, it seems to me that there are real challenges, but they're not challenges specific to anything I say in this book, right? They're the challenges of saying that Jesus is a genuine human being while affirming, any of the versions of, the divinity of Christ, other than ones that are at least somewhat closer to inspiration, or which risk falling afoul of the stipulation of the Creed of Chalcedon that the two natures are not sort of separated. So you can't just say, well, that's the divinity, but in his humanity, he's
exactly. Yeah.
And so, philosophers have questioned whether any formulation of a Christology actually meets the stipulations of the Creed of Chalcedon. And so that too gives me a good reason to avoid trying in a book. Right. There really isn't about that, right?
Yeah.
But I think that for the earliest followers of Jesus, for the people who encountered him, the very fact that it was possible for people to reject him means he was not glowing, right, with a halo over his head, beam of light coming down from the sky saying, maybe with, depending on your view of the historicity or otherwise of a couple of stories, maybe with one or two exceptions, right, where something like that happened. But generally speaking, right, you are encountering a human being. Yeah. And that is the impression you have. And it's possible to not see anything more in your encounter if you're there at the time, because some people didn't, right? And however much you want to attribute that to hardness of heart and lack of perception, it seems to me that we're dealing with somebody whose genuine humanity really needs to be treated as a given. right? It's there, and it's not something that one can deny. And of course, you can't deny it without also falling afoul of the Creed of Chalcedon. But in general, very few people seem to be concerned that they are, diluting Jesus' humanity. We won't say denying it, because few would come right out and do that, but are diluting it and making him less human through the process of allowing divinity, which is what's more important to them, to overshadow humanity time and time again. And so another reason why I focus on the human Jesus, it's not just that I'm a historical Jesus scholar, and so that's the thing I do, and that's what people in my own narrowly defined field are most interested in, I assume, but because the question is a broader one that goes beyond what my book is about, which is it possible for people to take serious Jesus' humanity if they subscribe to his divinity without feeling the need over and over again to say, oh, but we can't say that because he was divine. But, oh, well, we can't say it. No, that's no, And before you know it, even his mother as an influence has been denied. And then you ask the question, is he really human any longer at all?
Yep. That's a great point. And I do think that there's a way in which presupposing a certain sort of metaphysics to do with the being of God and sort of allowing that to control what we see about Jesus in the gospel stories that we have. To me, that seems to be what's actually doing the work. We're presupposing the stuff about what it means to be divine, what it means to be God, what being is, all of that. And I think if we turn it kind of the other way around and begin with the narrated history of Jesus Christ, and in the light of that, rethink our metaphysics, I think an account of, Jesus's real nitty-gritty humanity, right, is, we can allow that to flourish and open up new possibilities, in terms of what we know about who Jesus was as a human being. And within that, even, I'm reminded of Karl Barth's book, The Humanity of God, that there is some sort of closeness here between divinity and humanity. There's no mixture or confusion, there's no separation, but there is a real closeness that we need to take seriously. And I think a book like yours definitely helps us think in that way, from the Jesus in history to, we can rethink our metaphysics, we can rethink our ontology and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that when you overemphasize the deity of Christ, however one thinks about that, in any type of sort of Christian theology, then it becomes almost impossible to envisage Jesus as humble, right?
Yeah.
It's like, he's a know-it-all, right? Literally. Even though, again, there are things in the Gospels that suggest otherwise. But it's not just the Gospels, right? Given your interest in Paul, let's mention Paul talks about Jesus, humbling himself, right? And so if it's at all possible, and again, I avoided wading into these waters, but if it's at all possible to say that divinity and humanity intersect in some way in the life of Jesus, then it has to be with sort of humanity at its best. And there's a lot in Christian theology that suggests that that's a humble humanity, right? It is one that is open to correction and willingness to learn and grow. And given that the Gospel of Luke says that Jesus grew in wisdom and in either maturity or stature, that's where we need to start looking if we're going to try to combine those things in any way, shape, or form, I think. And so hopefully my book is helpful in thinking about that, even if it's not telling you how to think about some of those wider issues.
Yeah, for sure. So we can move away from that that topic that is, it comes up in these discussions. But yeah, let's get into your book, and I want to start where you start, which is with Jesus's mother, Mary. And I'm hoping this can be a kind of like teaser for people who don't currently own the book, and maybe after watching this they'll go out and buy it. So let's start with Mary, and just I would simply ask briefly, what are some things that Jesus learned from his mother? What are some concrete things that he learned? according to what you found?
So I think we can say that the basics that one learns from one's mother, probably some speaking and making sounds that turn into words, sweeping and doing the dishes, one imagines, or things like that. But those are not treated in the book, but do want to give a shout out for the importance of those things. But really, I think that the Gospel of Luke is fascinating in this regard. It seems to actually care about what Jesus learned from his mother and seems to have a viewpoint on that, which is interesting because Acts talks about Mary continuing to be involved in the church subsequently. And so one assumption is, not necessarily directly, but that the author is aware that Mary has been involved and is involved in the Christian movement and is at least hearing some things, aware of some things, has a sense that, if you listen to Mary, you hear some of the things that were in the teaching of Jesus. And of course, one way of saying that is, Mary's, among his first sort of adherents and disciples. And we imagine that she did learn things from her son, right? If she believed that he was the Messiah, the long-awaited one. But the way it's framed is that Mary holds some of those things and is emphasizing some of those things, even before Jesus is born, right? We get them in the Magnificat. And so we have to, if we're taking Luke seriously, that Mary says these things before Jesus is born, and then Jesus grows in wisdom, he goes home and is obedient to his parents. He is one who learns. Then the natural conclusion is that some of his emphasis on God, lifting up the poor, but bringing down the haughty and the powerful, things of that sort that we find in the Lucan Beatitudes in particular, and in the Magnificat, are signs of Mary's influence on Jesus, at least as far as the author of the Gospel of Luke is concerned. And so some of those characteristics definitely are ones that I think one should begin with in thinking about this.
Yeah. Next, I want to talk about the Sierraphonician Woman.
Okay.
Because this comes up a lot in, it's an example of where, as you mentioned, it seems as though Jesus is changing his mind on something because of what this woman has said in response to what's clearly an insult coming from Jesus to her, calling her a dog. The first thing I want to ask you about, and you addressed this in the chapter, but just for people who are listening, I think there's a common way to understand how insulting this was, which is this was explicitly sort of racist. Obviously, race being that's a complicated issue, but this has become kind of a popular way of understanding this, is that Jesus is being explicitly sort of racist or a bit differently ethnocentric in his thinking, right? So how insulting was this, calling this woman a dog?
Right. So in general, calling someone a dog in most cultures is not complimentary, right? There seems to be a widespread agreement across a wide array of cultures. I've yet to find one in which saying, you are a dog is completely complimentary. And I say that as someone who teaches at an institution where we our cheer is "Go Dogs," right? Because
That's
it's
right.
a bulldog is our mascot, things like that. So yeah, there are contexts, and so maybe it's like the Sierraphonician mascot was, there's and you could go there or something, but ultimately, right? If we look at what specifically Jesus is recorded as having said, right, according to the story, he says, the children need to eat first. It's not appropriate to take their food away from them and give it to the dogs, even if it's household dogs, right? Even if he said, we're not taking the bread away from the children to give it to the puppies, right? It's like, puppies, right? And so it's cute, right? That's about as cute as you can get with the dogs, right? And yet, even so, there's a contrast between puppies and children, right? And so one way or another, there's a sort of ethnocentrism about this, right? Even if it's a cute kind of puppy dog scenario, right? And so even in the best case scenario, I think there's a distinction being made between his own people and others who might eventually get the crumbs, but he's like, not now, now I'm focused on something else. And, it's at best, it's wait your turn because this is for this people and not for you.
Yeah. AJ Levine, as I'm sure you know, has a now fairly famous line on the distinction between puppies and dogs that I'm not going to repeat here because it has a word that I'm not comfortable saying. But those of you who are interested in this can look this up. It really, even if it is a puppy, it doesn't actually do anything to the nature of the insult, right?
He may not have called her that particular word that you're thinking of either, right? So it may not
exactly
be that.
Right.
But it doesn't sound like it's even if you stick a diminutive on there, it's not clear that in the language that Jesus probably was speaking with the woman, one guesses it was Aramaic, that it would have had something that reflected that. And so there too, we might have the gospel author, telling the story in Greek, softening things ever so slightly, or it's hard to know precisely, right, because of that. But it's hard to think of it as entirely complimentary, and it certainly isn't welcoming, saying let's have this be for everyone. And yet Jesus does something that he was not inclined to do by the end of the encounter, and that too, I think, the gospel is clear about.
So let's talk about the end of that encounter. Can you kind of walk us through sort of what happens when Jesus says this to the woman, and how does she sort of respond?
Yeah. So what we're told is that she has a clever comeback, right? It's like, okay, even the dogs eat what falls from the children's tables, right? And one of the most fascinating things that I was afraid I might not think of a way to include, because it's very, very general and not very specifically related to this, but the Phoenicians loved their dogs, right? We know this from one particular archaeological discovery, which is that there's this like huge dog cemetery, right? Which I don't know about you, but I didn't know it was a thing, right? I did actually see a news item about it not that long ago. But dogs were important to them in some way that was not typical, right? And whether it's they just valued them as companions, whether it's that they treated them as sacred, they offered them as sacrifices to gods, dogs are important to them in a way that they're not for other surrounding people, including the Jews, who reside in Galilee and Judea. And so it really did start me thinking that this woman probably perceived in Jesus' insult, that Jesus knows something about, the Syrians and Phoenicians, and is making a jab, right, at them, their love for dogs and the fact that dogs are kind of important to them. And as she's probably thinking she's going to just go, or maybe give him some choice words and then go, but as things are running through her mind, it probably strikes her that this is being unnecessarily cruel, because if you actually keep even crumbs from reaching the dogs, that's the children are, if this family is wealthy enough to have dogs in their home, and it's not just street urchins, street animals in there, then the dogs are going to eat the crumbs that fall from the table, right? That's part of their role, right? They actually help keep the house tidy, and you don't have to actually go out of your way to feed them because they're picking up scraps. But if you're withholding the scraps, then that's actually kind of cruelty to animals. And so I can imagine this woman, being very bright and actually thinking of a rejoinder and saying, even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from when the children drop food, the dogs get to eat them. And so, basically telling Jesus that he's being unnecessarily cruel, I think, in saying that. And as I fleshed out the story, I imagine Jesus actually, probably, being genuinely impressed, right? And I think, one way of reading the differences between some of the Gospels is that, he may have been initially impressed and decided to do something for this woman, but actually been more impressed as time passed and he thought about it, right? And so across the gospel tradition, I think it's entirely possible that we sometimes get something that's a little bit closer to the in-the-moment historical reality, and then sometimes is definitely more developed, but more developed doesn't necessarily mean that it's further removed from Jesus if we think about Jesus himself as potentially reflecting on his experiences and learning from them and taking things away from them. And so I came to envisage Jesus thinking differently about this encounter, probably not just when it started and then at the end when she leaves, but probably later in his life thinking back on it and being influenced by it in other ways as well.
Yeah. Can you comment on some ways in which Jesus would have reflected on this and how it would have informed the way that he thought about missions in particular?
Yeah.
What this message is actually for, who it's for.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of places where we might actually see influence of this encounter on things that Jesus says. The Gospels sometimes, because Canaanite is as far reaching into Gentile territory as one can go, right? Because there is this actual hostility, sort of genocidal hostility, in sort of Deuteronomy and Judges, it's like wipe out the Canaanites and things of that sort. And so a number of the Gospels sort of build up to that. And yet it seems to me that the logic of the progression of events, the sequence of events and the development of Jesus' openness to Gentiles more likely runs from, this woman's made her point. This dog in particular can get some scraps that fall from the children on this occasion, to thinking about that more generally, to being willing to say, wow, I haven't found this kind of faith even in Israel. Many are going to come from the East and the West, and they're going to actually join Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs at the Messianic banquet, right? And so at that point, he's saying they're going to sit at the table. And I don't think you get there in one step. Right? And I don't think if you're there already, you then say, I'm not giving bread from the children sitting at the table to the dogs, right? And say that to somebody because they're one of these people who will come from the East and the West, right? And so I think that in terms of the development in Jesus' thinking, there in that encounter, right, in at least some of the Gospels, it's an encounter with a centurion. It's somebody who one assumes is a Roman soldier and thus a non-Jew. It shows the impact, right? Another one that didn't occur to me until I was well into writing the chapter was the story of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, right? In which he would love to eat scraps that fall from the rich man's table, and the rich man doesn't give him any scraps, right? And so this is a class divide rather than an ethnic divide. But the dogs come and show kindness to Lazarus sitting at the rich man's gate while the rich man is refusing to give scraps. And there are so many points of contact with this story that, again, if Jesus had formulated this parable already and yet didn't apply it to this woman, then that really is sort of a gap in Jesus. It's like he's not applying his teaching to this encounter. I think people should be more bothered than that, than by the idea that Jesus learned, and that by the time he comes up with this story about the rich man and Lazarus, that he's actually being self-critical and humble and saying, I at one point wasn't giving the scraps from the table to a beggar, as it were. And this woman does beg for his help. And I was a lot like that rich man. And I learned from it. And this story is now to challenge others to do the same across a range of divides, not just an ethnic one.
Yeah, that's a wonderful connection. I love that. Just for people who are watching and who are in the live chat, if you have any questions for Dr. McGrath, you can go ahead and put them in the live chat. We'll get to them in a little bit. We're coming up on about 45 minutes. So if you have any questions, given what we've been talking about, please feel free to do that and we'll get to them. As you were talking about Jesus's encounter with the Sierraphonician woman, and that he wouldn't have this wouldn't have been like his mind would have been immediately changed, and then he would have suddenly realized, oh, I've been thinking about this stuff wrong. It's a process. This is how people work. Yeah. Very rarely do we suddenly just change our mind and our paradigms shift like immediately, right? It takes a long time to do that. Can you comment a bit on how this engagement between Jesus and this Sierraphonician woman can help us think about contemporary issues of people who are very sort of stuck in their ways, I guess, or stuck in certain harmful
biases,
prejudiced ways of thinking, right?
Yeah.
Kind of moving out of that. How do you see this as kind of helping us think through that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think the story of Jesus, particularly as told in Luke's gospel, helps us to think about is, if a Christian, whatever their precise theology, is inclined to think that Jesus embodies humanity at its best, then that's a human being who learns and grows in wisdom, right? It's not one who is static, right? Who knows it all from his early years or at any later point, right? So he is someone who learns, and we're not told that then eventually he stops learning and knows everything, right? And then the divinity kicks in, right? But by way of human learning, or something, it's like, okay. Anyway, and so there's no human being born, at when history is already well underway, who is going to be free from influence of prejudices, right? The things that people assume, the kinds of things that, come up in families, come up among people as they're talking, right? And so the only way to think about Jesus being humanity at its best, embodied and exemplified, is that some of those things that he would have been steeped in from childhood, he overcomes them, right? He's willing to change his mind about them. And if we want to call ourselves followers of Jesus, seeking to be the best kind of human beings that we can be, even maybe not as Christians, if you're watching this and that's not a tradition you subscribe to, then I think being willing to learn, being willing to have your assumptions challenged is the best that one can hope for from a human being. And if we're going to say that Jesus was fully human, and if one, from a faith perspective, wants to say that he embodies humanity at its best, then I think that is humanity at its best, and that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah, this is fascinating, because it seems like this is this is an example, I think, of Jesus having learned something prior about sort of his relationship to Gentiles, right? I'm not saying that it's from his mother or anything like that, but this seems to be something that Jesus had learned or picked up on. And then that changed too. He's learning and then relearning things along his life. And again, this is just a great example of like what human lives are really all about. We learn things, and these things become sort of cemented in our thinking and our acting and our relationships with other people, right? And then that stuff, can be learned in a different way. Those assumptions can be challenged, and we can move in a different direction, right? I think that's just, it's very, very cool. Very cool to me. So before we go to Q&A, I want to talk about Joanna.
Yeah.
Because this was, and I'm sure this was surprising to you, as you sort of alluded to earlier, that what you talk about in the Joanna chapter is that Joanna possibly is Junia, as referenced in Paul, right? So can you talk a little bit, how you mentioned a thread that you were sort of pulling on, and sort of, I think you've mentioned it in another video you've done, as like a thread pulling on, from a sweater, and eventually you sort of see the whole thing, right? So what was that thread that you were sort of pulling on, and how did you kind of come to this? I'm not sure how sort of confidently you hold this conclusion that Joanna is Junia, but how did you sort of get there?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to say is that, when you start pulling on the thread of the sweater or whatever it is, what you see is the whole thing unravel. But sometimes what you find is that threads that you pull on different what you think are different threads, and you find they're connected.
Yeah, it's the
and I
same
certainly
one.
found a number of those instances in this.
Right.
And so I approached this with utter skepticism.
Right.
I was it seemed at best purely speculative when I initially encountered the idea, and then I'm sure I was disinclined to pursue it, because if these are not two influential women in the Jesus movement at various stages, then I've just cut the number of influential women that we can talk about, which runs counter to my aims in this book, right, in some important ways. But ultimately, if this is one woman about whom we can say more because we have more than one piece of evidence, then that gives us a richer picture, and that's worth pursuing. But some of the things that started to just fall into place as I explored the possibility and said, okay, I better start thinking about this. Right? So one is, Joanna is the wife of Chuza, right? Who is that's a Nabatean name, and his property manager for Herod Antipas, and so he is a Nabatean and is in that role, and Herod Antipas has sort of Edomian, Nabatean connections, both through ancestry and through marriage, and so part of that complicated story of the Herods, there. But among the things that you start thinking about, right? So on the one hand, Paul says he's of the tribe of Benjamin, right? He's aware of that as part of his background, and historically they're from kind of that area around Jericho, right, which is where you get the tribes that are on the western side of the Jordan. You get the intersection with Transjordan, and you get a city right in the sort of as a hub of that territory, where Transjordanian peoples are also to be found in this historical era, as well as prior eras, but definitely in this historical era, we have these peoples intersecting there. And so if you have a Jewish woman, right, an Israelite woman married to a Nabatean, then where and how could that come about? And then as I started thinking about, she is said to be, but Junia is said to be, prominent among the apostles and in Christ before Paul, right, and a relative of his. And Joanna is mentioned, right, as a prominent woman in the Christian movement in Luke, right? Luke's gospel, of course, is the one that is most closely connected with Paul. And however one understands the phrase prominent among the apostles, right, I'm happy to just take it as she's a prominent apostle, but she's there involved in the movement at that early stage, and so those descriptions fit naturally together, right? They're almost like different ways of saying the same thing. And it's somebody from the tribe of Benjamin who could naturally have that sort of Arabian connection. And if Joanna has those connections and is related to Paul, then her marriage, which if he was more narrow on the question of Jews marrying people who are not Jewish, right, even though Chuza may well have converted in order to marry her, but that may have been one of the reasons that Paul was so adamantly opposed to this this movement, right, that Junia was part of, right, that they were fine with this sort of thing, whereas he was appalled by it, and so the two were connected. And that would explain to us not just why he opposed the movement, but why, becoming persuaded that he was wrong and that his relative who was in Christ before him was right, leads him to also rethink his view of Gentiles, right? It's not exactly clear why that happens as a result of his turnaround. And it's not something that, in connection with the stoning of Stephen that he's associated with by Acts or anything else, that was something that would naturally come up. And whereas if this is part of that story and his family's story, then we understand his adamant opposition and why his turnaround takes the character that it does. And then one other thing, which is a puzzle for historians working on Paul: why is his first response to go to, why does he go to Damascus, which is ruled by a Nabatean king, in order to persecute, continue his persecution? And why, after his turnaround, does he go to Arabia, right? I mean, that's, again, not a natural thing to do, unless this movement that he's been opposing in particular, family members, and he goes to make amends with them and to learn from them and to be reconciled to relatives, both immediate and through marriage, as well as to get away from the place where he has been involved in persecution and now is not reporting back to those who sent him with this mission, saying mission accomplished, but saying, actually, I've changed my mind and I'm on their side of that. So he does have reason to leave, but where he goes connects with some of these threads. And so none of these individual threads, gives us this picture, but there are a lot of loose ends about Paul and about Junia and about Joanna. And as I started pulling on them, it seemed like they could connect naturally, right? It's not that they have to, but otherwise they are simply loose ends. And this does tie them together.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very fascinating. Very fascinating. So since I don't see any questions for you, James. So I'm going to ask you two. I think you've convinced everybody.
There we go. That's one's spoken.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you two kind of final questions. And these are sort of more kind of practical questions in the light of your work. I know that you spent time sort of workshopping in some ways the manuscript and chapters with folks at your church. I believe you go to an American Baptist church, right? Mm-hmm. What sort of impact do you hope that your book has on the church and in Christian education settings?
Yeah. I'm hoping sometime soon to actually have like an online YouTube conversation with a couple of other authors of recent books about women in the early Christian movement. So there have been a number of books about it, right? And there are also some which have tried to address sort of the modern phenomenon of sort of biblical womanhood and the sort of toxic masculinity you get in certain circles and all these kinds of things, but which also intersect with the question of, were women involved in leadership in the early Christian movement, right? And so biblical interpretation and contemporary practice are entangled in connection with this, and it's a live issue for some denominations more than others. And American Baptists are absolutely, positive in terms of ordaining women and have been for a long time. But we're also Congregationalist, which means that, if your congregation doesn't want a woman minister, nobody's going to force you either, right? And so,
I'm United Church of Christ, so we do things pretty similarly. Yeah.
So there are advantages and disadvantages to every sort of configuration of church. But one thing I will say is that a lot of the books that have been written, none of them I think explores Jesus learning in this way, and so there's that, which I think is unique to mine. But also, I just dive right in and don't, try to persuade you that women should be ordained and that the women are involved in this movement. I tell the stories and look at the historical evidence and try to approach it that way. And so, I think there are other books which I'd recommend first if you're like, Jesus couldn't learn from women because women have nothing to teach any man ever, anywhere. I'll be like, okay, I think there's another book you should read before you try and read mine. Because mine is really assuming, that you're at least open to the possibility of men learning. You may still have issues with Jesus learning because of your Christology or something else. And there, I will help you to the extent that I can while still staying focused on the topic. But my book really does take for granted that you're open to that and ask you to then really dig into the historical evidence, right? How might Jesus have been influenced? What might women have done? Who were these women? What can we know about them? And what can we see that we are missing because of the fact that ancient male authors tended not to even include their names a lot of the time, certainly not to give us their full story to the extent that we would have liked. And so that's what my book seeks to offer. And it does so in a way that I think will allow people in churches to engage with stories and think about them. Think about not just what's the role of women in my church and how does it compare to the role of women in the Jesus movement, but also who is Jesus if I approach him through the lens of his encounter with these women.
Yeah. I think that's the one of the most important takeaways from your book is that it's asking you to ask the question constantly and reflect on it. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And then for the church, who is Jesus for us here and now, given what we're reading in these texts that we have that we're enjoying to learn from, right? Yeah, I think that's wonderful. On the flip side of the sort of impact that you hope this would have on the church, we do have a number of agnostic and atheist listeners and watchers of this channel. I'm curious if you've thought about how your book might impact people who aren't confessing Christians. And in what way have you thought about that, if you have?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I certainly wrote the book thinking that, as so often with books about Jesus, it's going to be people who have a vested interest in Jesus of one sort or another who take the most interest. But that's not just people in churches. And I've engaged with the question of atheist and agnostic approaches to the historical question of Jesus, not least because there are a lot of atheists, surprising numbers of atheists who subscribe to a viewpoint on the historicity of Jesus, or the ahistoricity of Jesus, I should say, that is not the conclusion of mainstream scholars, regardless of whether they are Christian of any description, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, anything else. And so I think that my book really does take the humanity of Jesus completely seriously. Right? You don't need to think of Jesus as anything other than a human being who was had a certain kind of influence and was part of a particular cultural context and religious context in order to read my book and engage with it. Right? I may have made some assumptions, coming to it from my own perspective. Authors always do, but trying to do what I seek to do as a historical Jesus scholar, I was trying to approach this building on the evidence. Now, given that I'm writing about ancient women, and our sources often silence these women, right, through their neglect, through their, the paucity of information they give us, I let my imagination fill in around the evidence, and that's part of my method, right? And I would say that I think that even when we're talking about Jesus, we are using our imagination more than we sometimes admit.
Yeah,
right?
when we're doing historical work,
right?
We do it.
So I think that's an important aspect of this book is by using the imagination in that way to say, well, how do we turn the little tidbits of information we have into story in plausible ways? It's actually highlighting what we do in history generally, and both problematizing it, but also hopefully elevating it and saying, if we're going to talk about the past, we have no choice but to do this thing. And even if you are somebody who is disinclined to, to accept that there was a historical Jesus, then you've got to use your imagination to come up with a more plausible, more likely scenario in which Jesus is invented, right? So you're not off the hook. And so that question of how the imagination serves as a tool for historical investigation is one of the things that I think people can get out of it. But I think they'll find that I'm not actually, I'm at least trying not to import anything that is that requires one to be a Christian into the discussion of what the historical evidence says.
Right. One more question before you go, just real quick. What's next? What are you working on right now? If you wouldn't mind sharing. Yeah.
So I'm trying to finish off a couple of things between now and the end of the academic year that's about to start. Because after that, if all goes smoothly and there isn't a pandemic that has everything, another pandemic or an ongoing pandemic that suddenly has what variant might we be up to by then? I don't even want to think about it and go through the Greek alphabet. But hoping to be on sabbatical and working on a book about the historical John the Baptist. And so somebody once ended a podcast about my book saying, so what's next? What Jesus learned from men? And I was like, well, actually, because John is thought of as the mentor of Jesus. And so there's a sense in which that is a natural place to go. But it's much more drawing on the work I've done on the Mandaeans and asking, can those sources play any useful role? Can their living tradition play any useful role in our investigation of the historical figure of John the Baptist.
Awesome. That's wonderful. We'll be on the lookout for that I'm not sure when that'll come out, but hopefully in the next couple of years. Yep. But James, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. Like we said, it's been a long time coming for us to chat about your book, and I'm glad we finally got to do it. And this was just a joy to have you on. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who is in the live chat, everyone who's been watching this interview this afternoon. I really appreciate you. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do click the subscribe button and also like the video, leave a comment. All that stuff sort of helps this channel continue to grow. So we're so thankful for all of you who've been supporting us. And with that, this has been Apocalypse Here. See you later.